welcome, and thank you so much for coming tonight. We are really excited to have Barbara Rae-Venter with us. I am Casey Mano. I am the branch supervisor at the Central Library right here. So I'm just going to give you a little introduction to Ms. Rae-Venter. Barbara Rae-Venter is a New Zealand-born American investigative genetic genealogist, biochemist, and retired patent attorney, best known for her work helping the FBI and other investigators identify Joseph James DeAngelo as the Golden State Killer. She earned a PhD at the University of California at San Diego, and later a law degree at the University of Texas at Austin Law School. Rae-Venter is a founder and the president of Firebird Forensics Group, a not-for-profit corporation. Her investigative work earned her a place on the Time 100 list for the most influential people in 2019, and she was recognized by the Journal of Nature as one of the 10 people who mattered in science in 2018. So without further ado, let me please welcome Ms. Barbara Rae-Venter.
Hello, and thank you.
Welcome, welcome. So I'm going to start with an easy question. You grew up in New Zealand, but you've spent your adulthood in the U.S. So how would you describe your accent? It's very
My
interesting.
accent?
Yes.
I don't have an accent. When I go back to New Zealand, they won't even believe I'm from there. They think I'm American.
I listened to the audio and I kept going, she's from New Zealand? Was she just born there? Yeah, so, okay, just silliness. So we know that some of our guests here with us tonight may not be as familiar with your work as some of the other folks that are joining us. Would you mind kind of getting everyone up to speed with an overview of your education, the path that your career took, and how you found yourself doing the work of investigative genetic genealogy?
How long do we have? So I sort of reinvented myself a few times over. I started out way back when, actually, as a computer programmer. I was one of those notorious COBOL programmers, so I've really kind of dated myself. So in terms of education, I have a bachelor's degree in psychology and biochemistry, and a PhD in biochemistry. Those are both from the University of California at San Diego, and then a law degree from University of Texas at Austin. And so I started out doing cancer research. I was primarily interested in breast cancer. I was trying to work on creating a drug that would target breast cancer. And so I was doing that both as a graduate student and then also as a postdoctoral fellow at Roswell Park Memorial Institute in Buffalo. And then from there, I was an assistant professor at the University of Texas Medical Branch in Galveston. And I taught biochemistry and endocrinology and continued my cancer research, both in breast cancer and also in colon cancer. And then somewhere along the line, I decided I wanted to go to law school. So I applied to the University of Texas and was fortunate to get in. And back then, because I was a Texas state resident, my tuition was something like $79 a quarter. So I didn't have any student loans, which was nice. And then from there, what I was actually really interested in was in medical bioethics. Back then, the big questions of the day were what to do with frozen embryos, things like transplants, particularly pediatric tissue, who was going to get the tissue. So there were, I just found those questions kind of fascinating. But when I was looking for jobs, people would look at my resume and they'd say, well, you've got all this science. You should be a patent attorney. So it sounded kind of dry. But fortunately, University of Texas actually had some intellectual property classes, so I took those, and actually it was kind of interesting. And so it was probably one of the most fun jobs you could possibly have if you're a science junkie, because you're learning. So I was the kind of patent attorney that actually writes the patent applications and then deals with the patent office to try and get a patent for the client. So you're learning all of the newest, spiffiest stuff in science from all these amazing scientists. Most of the clients, I was doing this in Palo Alto, so we did a lot of stuff for Stanford, for University of California, and various other little biotech startups. So lots of really exciting science. It was fun.
That's awesome.
That's fantastic. I'm really curious if anything in your background sort of led you to genetic genealogy, or was that something you completely discovered after you were done with your professional career?
That was totally after I'd retired. I started, as was mentioned, I grew up in New Zealand, and it turns out that my relatives on my father's side of the family had actually been immigrants to New Zealand, and I had not known that until I actually started working on some of this stuff. And so they had all gone from the north of Scotland to Nova Scotia, where they'd lived for about 3 decades, and then they'd gone first to Australia, and this was a group of some 1,200 folks who were followers of a guy called the Reverend Norman MacLeod. So these were folks who were devout Presbyterians. And so they initially set out from Nova Scotia to Australia, and they arrived just at the start of the gold rush. And so there are whores, and there's booze, and there's all kinds of stuff which these folks just, it is not their lifestyle. And so the Reverend wrote to the governor of New Zealand and said, can we have some land in New Zealand? And so he gave them some land in a place called Waipu. And so they actually founded a Gaelic-speaking community in the north of the North Island of New Zealand. And it turns out that actually my great-great-grandfather was one of the first children born in this new community. So when I started trying to do genealogy, I'm trying to connect the dots back from New Zealand to Nova Scotia to Scotland. There's almost no paper trail. So that's actually how I got into doing genetic genealogy, is because I was trying to track my relatives. So what I did is I then corresponded with people who had similar ancestry and got them all to do DNA testing so we could start trying to connect some of the dots.
That's fascinating. Thank you.
So your work has given answers to investigators, survivors, and families of victims, as evidenced by the book title. Your name may well go down in history related to having helped catch the Golden State Killer. Is there a particular investigation you helped solve that you hope history will remember you for if it is not the Golden State Killer?
Well, it's certainly probably one of the most famous cases, just because he was so horribly prolific. But there are other cases which are interesting for different reasons. One that I worked on fairly recently was a case of a little girl whose remains were found in Opelika, Alabama. Her skull was found near a trailer park, and then when the police started investigating, they then discovered more of her bones across the street in a little sort of wooded area. What was chilling was that of the bones that they found, some 15 of these bones showed healing fractures. This is a little girl that was estimated to be probably about 5 or 6 years old. Working on the case was difficult. As probably most of you are aware, the DNA databases are primarily white, particularly Western European white. And so this little girl was black. And so trying to then identify who she was, and then of course figure out who had killed her, was a little bit more difficult. What made the case really interesting was one of the things that we use when we're doing investigative genetic genealogy is geography is huge. So it's as the real estate agents say, location, location, location. So here we had Opelika, Alabama. And so when we start getting people who are matches then to this little girl, of course, we're looking for people who have a connection to Opelika. Well, we didn't have anybody with any connection to Opelika. We didn't even have anybody who was connected to even to Alabama. We had some scientific studies that had been done that showed that she had grown up in Alabama or one of the surrounding states. So this was a little disappointing. So we had two groups of matches. We had one that was a lone match, which showed relatives in North Carolina, and then we had another group of matches who matched each other, so they were all related, and they were from Norfolk, Virginia. And so this was kind of confusing, but so we built out trees for these people, and then one of the lone match that was from North Carolina, the woman who was that match, she had a tree on Ancestry. And in her family tree, her tree that she had built out and posted there matched what we'd built. And so we were a little puzzled as to what was happening. And then she posted a note that she had gone to a family reunion the weekend before, and somebody at the family reunion had said, you're not really who you think you are. Your great-great-grandmother is really this woman called Hester. And so she had posted this, and so we looked at Hester. And as I said, this is a lone match. We didn't have any shared matches. So normally what you would do is you would try to find common ancestors and then build down from there to try and identify, the descendants. So in this case, we just built down from her tree to see where it would go. Well, Hester, it turned out, was from Alabama. When we built her tree down, there was one descendant, a male descendant, who lived in Opelika, Alabama. So suddenly, there was a potential candidate for the father for our little girl. So he did not live any longer in Alabama. He was in the Navy, and he was stationed in Norfolk, Virginia. So the detective went out to visit this guy's mother, who was still alive, still lived in Opelika. And she was asked, did she have a granddaughter? No granddaughter. Did she know of any little girls in the family who were missing? No little girls missing in the family. And then as the detective was leaving, she said, would it be helpful if I did a DNA test? So of course the detective leaps at the opportunity, races out to his car, gets a kit, does a buccal swab, and she came back as being either a great-grandmother or a grandmother to our little girl. So the next thing that was done is they did what we call the trash pull on the son, because there was a huge X chromosome match. And when you see a big X chromosome match, it's particularly from a woman to her son. He's inheriting his X chromosome from his mother. And so the chances were she was actually the grandmother of our little girl, which meant her son would be the father. So the trash pull revealed, in fact, he was the father of the little girl. So now it was kind of interesting that he was stationed in Norfolk, Virginia, which is where our other group of matches were. So we started looking at those. We had built out a really nice tree, and we'd identified 3 sisters and a first cousin who were potentially the mother of our little girl. And so one of the ladies in my group who was researching on this case, she was able to find where the potential father, his name was Lamar Vickerstaff, where Lamar had been living. And it turned out he'd been living in apartment number 9 in a building where in apartment number 1 was one of our sisters, a name by the name of Sherry Wiggins. So the detective interviewed Sherry Wiggins. Yes, she had a daughter, but her daughter was alive and well. She did not have custody of her little girl. The father of the little girl did. And who was the father? Lamar Vickerstaff. Turns out that she had gotten into trouble. She'd also been in the Navy. She'd gotten into trouble. She'd lost custody of her little girl, and custody had been given to Lamar and his wife. She had been paying $400 a month in child support up until the present day. Her little girl had been dead for 11 years. I cannot imagine that poor woman, the feelings that she must have had when she discovered this. And so, yeah, we were able to confirm that she was, in fact, the mother. So Lamar has obviously been arrested, and also his wife. So we will see what happens. But it was a fascinating case, and it was interesting how the geography played out when we had thought nothing was making any sense, when suddenly it did.
That's crazy. That's fascinating.
Can we all just take a moment?
Thank you, Barbara. What makes a case appealing to you, and how do you decide what to accept and what to pass on?
So actually, we don't pass on any cases. We take on all cases that are brought to us. And what we do is we have a relatively modest fee that we charge law enforcement. It's a fixed fee, and we work on a case until it's solved, no matter how difficult. We actually have a case that we're working on right now where the matches that we have are very, very distant, but it's a horrible case. It's the rape of a 3-year-old boy and a 12-year-old girl. And so we are bound and determined to solve that case, even though the matches are so distant.
So are you exclusively working with law enforcement now, or do you continue to do adoptee genealogy as well?
The only time I do adoptee type stuff now is actually when we have a match who's an adoptee, and in order to solve our case, we need to figure out who the adoptee is. Otherwise, no, I focus on the cases.
So you speak to ethical concerns of the direct-to-consumer DNA databases such as Ancestry in support of this work, off and on throughout the book. Obviously, you're still doing the work, so you are not in opposition to it, but that doesn't mean that there's not still some kind of struggle there. So I'm curious if you consider someone who is fully opposed at one end of the spectrum and someone who is completely in favor of it with no exception at the other end, where do you find yourself, and does that change?
So I'm going to come at that a little differently. So I came into doing this kind of work from doing unknown parentage cases. So people who were adopted, people who are donor conceived, people who, for whatever reason, don't know who their parents are. So, for example, the very first criminal case I worked on, the one of Lisa Jensen, who had been abducted as an infant. So, on all of those cases, nobody raises any privacy concerns for people trying to find out who their biological relatives are. To me, it seems almost hypocritical that the same people who work on unknown parentage cases turn around and say, those of you who are working on solving violent crimes, you're violating people's privacy. Because actually, people who were donor conceived, the donors were guaranteed anonymity. And of course, that's now no longer possible because they can now just go get DNA tested and figure out who their parents were. So I have a little bit of a problem, I guess, with the fact that there seems to be two different standards here. It seems like either neither should be acceptable or both should be acceptable.
Are you at all involved in advocacy related to legislation that would impact the level of access that you currently have to do this type of work?
I actually am not. I spent a lot of time working on cases, and I truly just don't have the bandwidth to do anything else. So no, I have not been involved in that.
This almost feels like an aside to me because I know what she's going to say. Do you want to quickly share with everyone what you told us about the difference in if you have connected with Ancestry or 23andMe versus GEDmatch?
Oh, sure. So you mean the people want to help law enforcement? Sure. So I was just recently at Comic-Con, not Comic-Con, excuse me, at CrimeCon. That was an interesting slip.
A little bit different.
So anyway, at CrimeCon, we had a lot of people who were coming. So I had a booth there with Gene by Gene. And so we, of course, were asking people if they'd done DNA testing. And they'd say very proudly, yes, they'd done DNA testing. These are all true crime fans. And so we would say, well, where did you test? Well, they'd tested at 23andMe or Ancestry primarily. And so we said, you know that those databases don't allow for upload of forensic files. The only two databases that do are GEDmatch, which is not a testing company, it's just a third-party site, or Family Tree DNA. So unless you're in one of those databases, you're not actually, helping. And so we actually had to do an extra printing of the instructions on how to transfer files from either 23andMe or Ancestry to GEDmatch or to Family Tree DNA because people didn't know. They thought that just by doing DNA testing, they were helping law enforcement, and they were not. So if you do want to help law enforcement, please, if you've tested, or if you haven't, please go and test. But then take your DNA profile and download it from wherever you've tested, and then upload to either GEDmatch or Family Tree DNA or both. And you have to opt in to allow law enforcement matching. So that would be huge if you would do that. That would be a big help.
On a similar note, so Ancestry.com and 23andMe are very popular sites to do DNA testing, and they are currently unavailable as they are private companies and they won't release their information. So if there came a day where they decided to sort of open up their books and let anyone in, how do you think that would change your work?
Oh, it would be huge. So the Ancestry database is about 30 million people. 23andMe, I think, is around 15. The databases that we can use, Family Tree DNA is about 2 million, and not everybody is opted in. And GEDmatch is about 3 million, but maybe only a quarter of those are opted in. So we're talking about 10-fold, 20-fold difference in the number of people that would be available. I would love it if they would do something like Family Tree DNA is doing, where if you have tested there, that you would be given the option to opt into law enforcement matching. You wouldn't have to, but you could choose to if that was what you wanted to do. It would really revolutionize solving cases.
And the concern that these companies have stated are privacy concerns, correct?
Mainly privacy concerns, yeah. But if people opt in, then that takes care of that problem.
She already answered my next question. So this has obviously revolutionized how at least some violent crimes are being solved, but it can also be very time-consuming, and it may not be that all law enforcement agencies can put in that work. Do you have any idea how many people are a part of the IGG community, so to speak, that are doing work like you do that aren't law enforcement themselves, I guess is what I'm getting at.
I'm not sure what the number is now. There's probably, I would guess, at least a dozen. But we have some new tricks on the horizon in that what we're hoping to be able to do is use AI to help build trees, because that's the most time-consuming part. And it takes, particularly if you've got people who are relatively distant matches, and you're having to build back to, say, great-great-grandparents or great-great-great-grandparents, or maybe even further. And then, of course, you then have to turn around and build down in order to identify the living people who then comprise the pool where your person you're trying to identify is. So if you could use AI to do that, that would be incredible, because that takes sometimes weeks, depending on the matches, yeah. So I think there's some new tools on the horizon which will be a huge, huge game changer for us.
When we were speaking before we came out, I asked if she had any interest in returning to teaching now that there's all this new stuff. No. Quick answer, no. Sorry, I lost my place. Da-da-da.
Sure, no problem. So one of the things you mention in your book is what you refer to as the methodology. Can you explain the methodology for those who are unaware?
Sure. So the methodology is actually a technique that was developed by the folks at DNA Adoption to help adoptees find their birth relatives. So it's basically just taking the people who share DNA with the person who's trying to identify their in this case, their birth parents, and then building trees. And then what you do is you're looking for people who share DNA with the person who's trying to identify, say, a parent. So the premise is, if, let's say, you've got the person who's trying to identify their parents, and then you've got two people who are second cousins, and they're all matching at a second cousin level. So we have all kinds of charts that we can use to look at if you've got a certain amount of matching DNA, what kind of relationship that is. So if you've got three people then who are all matching as second cousins, what do you know about them? You know that they share a set of great-grandparents. So since they're all sharing DNA and they're sharing a set of great-grandparents, all you need to do, and I'll put the all in quotes, all you need to do then is build down and identify all of the descendants of that set of great-grandparents. And then what you do is you use information that you know about the person that you're trying to identify in order to identify them. So if we talk about the Golden State Killer, what did we know about him? We knew that the first rape had occurred, or at least that we were aware of, had occurred in 1976. So he was probably born in say, 1956 or earlier. He was active in California, especially Northern California. So he probably lived in Northern California, probably even lived in Sacramento. What else did we know about him? We knew some information. We knew that he had been blonde. We knew that he was around somewhere between 5'8" and 6 feet. And then using his DNA, I was able to determine that he had blue eyes. And so you put all that together, and then you look at the people when you start building your reverse tree after you've identified common ancestors, who fits that particular profile. So on an initial cut where you're looking just at the geography, we actually only had 9 men on that list, which was pretty amazing. And it turned out that the family had actually been immigrants to New York, and there was just one branch of the family that had moved to California. And then if we took those 9 men, and what the FBI did is they pulled the California driver's license records for those 9 men and looked to see, did any of them have blue eyes? One man had blue eyes, Joseph D'Angelo. So I conveyed that information to Paul Holes and Steve Kramer, who were the 2 people I was working with. And so, of course, from there, they then put him under surveillance. And initially, they swabbed his car door handle when he went to a mall, and then ran that through. So what they're doing is when a crime has occurred, the crime scene DNA is put into the FBI database called CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System. And so there is a profile in CODIS. So they now then compare the DNA that they've gotten from the car door handle against the profile that's in CODIS, and it was a gazillion to 1 odds that it could be anybody else. It wasn't good enough. They'd only been waiting on 43 years to do this, so they decided to get another sample just to make sure. And so they got a tissue out of his trash and did the same thing with that. And again, it came back gazillion to 1 odds it could be anything else, and at that point he was arrested.
It's incredible that you were able to work on that and crack what 40 years of detective work was unable to. Can you tell me how long that took you?
The DNA stuff, from when we got, well, a problem was actually getting a DNA sample. So even though there had been over 50 rapes, or at least 50 rapes that we were aware of, because it was such an old case, every time there was new technology that came out, of course, people would take out their sample and they would take some of this and they would run it using whatever the new technology was. So actually, Paul Holes had run out of samples. He had, I think there were 3 rapes in Contra Costa County. And so then we were basically going hand in hand to all the other counties. There were 9 counties in total where there had been rapes that had occurred. And people either didn't have any DNA left or they didn't want to part with what they had. And then we actually got lucky. It turned out that in Ventura County, their medical examiner had an unusual technique that he used when he was doing rape kits. He took 2 samples, and he would freeze one of the samples, and then the other sample, which was also frozen, but whenever he was going to do additional tests, he would just use that one sample. So it turned out that Ventura County had a rape kit that had been sitting in their freezer for 38 years, was totally pristine, had never been unfrozen. And so the call rate, which is a test of how good the DNA was something like 95%. So we lucked out. And so the DNA that we had was just really, really good DNA.
I know that initially, after the case was publicly solved, you did not want to be named or recognized. So I'm curious, what changed?
So the reason I asked to remain anonymous, I'd actually done a couple of other criminal cases as well, and I'd asked to remain anonymous on those as well. It was mainly a safety concern. As one of the detectives put it, you don't know what kind of wingnuts are out there, that they're going to realize if they've left their DNA someplace that they shouldn't have, that I could probably identify them. And so it was more a safety concern than anything else. There was nobody else at the time doing this. And so then when other people started working on this, who were a lot more flamboyant than I am, then I felt it was probably okay to have it known that I had been involved in helping identify him.
Well, I'm really glad you did, because your story is absolutely fascinating.
Oh, thank you.
Of course.
One of the stories that you worked on that a fair number of you guys, if you haven't read the book yet, you probably know this, Bear Brook murders, she helped solve, which is amazing. Would you share a little bit about how the work with Lisa Jensen and the Bear Brook murders, and it eventually came to be a connection, what your part was in that and how they link in the end?
Sure. So the Lisa Jensen case was actually my first criminal case. She was basically a living Jane Doe. She had been abducted when she was about 6 months old. The man who abducted her was a pedophile. He kept her until she was about 5 years old. And he was at the time living in San Bernardino. And he was living in a trailer park. He was living in Santa Cruz County in a trailer park. And he became friendly with a couple that was living in the trailer park. And their daughter, who lived in San Bernardino, she and her husband were having trouble conceiving. And so he offered to them that their daughter could adopt Lisa, which was kind of an odd thing to do. And so what he suggested was a trial adoption. And so the couple agreed, and so they took Lisa with them back to San Bernardino. And then her behavior suggested that she'd probably been molested. And so they reported this to the sheriff's department in San Bernardino. And so, of course, in the San Bernardino Sheriff's Department then headed for the trailer park in Santa Cruz. Of course, he was long gone. But he was an electrician, and one of the things he'd been doing in the trailer park to earn his keep was he did electronic type stuff around the park. He had apparently very carefully wiped everything down, but he had installed, I think it was a television, and he missed one fingerprint. And so using that, they were able to track him down. He, of course, had disappeared. It was a while before he showed up again, but he eventually was arrested for murdering a woman he had married in a backyard ceremony in Contra Costa County, which, of course, is where Paul Holes was. And so he had actually gone to prison in California for murdering this woman. He had killed her with blunt force trauma. He had dismembered her, wrapped her in plastic, and then buried her in her basement under 200 pounds of kitty litter. So it turns out there were some similarities between the MO for that case and some murders in Manchester, New Hampshire. Now, when I was working on the Lisa Jensen case, it turned out I identified her mother as a woman called Denise Bodan, and she was from she was from Manchester, New Hampshire. The murders were in Allenstown, New Hampshire. And I had also identified some men who potentially were Lisa's father, but it turned out Lisa's grandfather is still alive. So we asked the grandfather, who is Lisa's father? And he said, Bob Evans. Well, Bob Evans was not one of the names I'd come up with. On a hunch, the deputy in San Bernardino sent a picture of Bob Evans, or at least the guy who had abducted Lisa, to the grandfather. He said, yes, that's Bob Evans. So suddenly the New Hampshire State Police were taking a lot closer look at this Bob Evans character and eventually concluded that he, in fact, was the murderer of the Allenstown Four. So from doing an unknown parentage case, trying to sort out who Lisa Jensen was, we actually then identified who the murderer was of the Allenstown Four. Lisa's mother is also missing. He probably murdered her. And then there's, amongst the Allenstown Four, there's an adult female and 3 little girls. The adult female and 2 of the little girls are related. The remaining little girl is the killer's daughter. So her mother is probably another victim.
That is several law enforcement agencies. And of course, people that are familiar with the backstory of the final days leading up to, or the final years, I guess, leading up to catching Golden State Killer, it was slowed down because some agencies didn't want to work with others. With the work that you've done, has that changed? Are people more willing now that they see what can be done?
In terms of interagency, I'm not sure if it's changed or not. There's still obviously a lot of competition to be, the people who have solved a case. I think one of the things that I find interesting is that for a lot of the cases that we actually work on, yes, we're assisting law enforcement, but quite often we're lucky if we're a footnote. But that's okay.
So with the advances that genetic genealogy is bringing to crime solving, do you think that we'll be able to solve some of the more infamous, outstanding cases?
I think we will, assuming that there's DNA that's available. Absolutely, there's no reason why we can't. So I think, the ones that people ask about are D.B. Cooper, the Zodiac. Zodiac is a little bit of a challenge because it's not clear that there's actually DNA available that is the Zodiac's. There's some hypotheses about using postage stamps and envelopes and things like that. Of course, Jean Bonnet. There are a number of cases that, so long as there's DNA available, they theoretically should be able to be solved.
It's interesting that you referenced those 2 cases because I had those 2 written down specifically. Those are ones that I personally am interested in. So one of the things you discuss in the book is the time invested to do this work, and sometimes it's thousands of hours, especially at the beginning. As we get more DNA profiles into GEDmatch, will all the work that goes into building out a family tree just not exist any longer?
No, that's not really going to change because unless somebody posts a tree, we don't really have access to that information. And so the place, of course, where people tend to post trees is Ancestry. So yes, we can see the trees on Ancestry if we can figure out who somebody is. And then, of course, a lot of the trees on Ancestry are not necessarily correct. So we do start from scratch on building the trees. But I think our biggest hope is, what I mentioned earlier, is if the technology can get to the point where we can use something like AI to build trees. Because, yeah, that is definitely the most labor-intensive part of all of this.
How important is it to you when you find a familial connection to verify those connections with documents and other supporting evidence?
We do. I mean, we build what's called a quick and dirty tree, but it's only quick and dirty in the sense that we don't do every single piece of paper that we could. What we're trying to do is at least find support for connecting people within a generation and for connecting one generation to the next generation. So even doing that can take a fair amount of work.
So for folks that are interested in investigative genetic genealogy, that's a lot to say, or even other things.
IgG is easier.
Very. Or even using existing skill sets with traditional genealogy to support IgG. What suggestions would you have for people to be able to get involved in that work, especially those of us who don't have a PhD in biochemistry?
Well, you don't really need a PhD in biochemistry. I think where most of us have actually started, we were talking about the 4 grandmothers earlier, and so I think where most of us have started is actually doing unknown parentage work, because it's the same technique. And so as long as you master the technique itself, there's no reason why you can't then turn around and apply that to working on violent crimes and identifying suspects.
I just assume there'd be a lot more to it because you use all this terminology in the book. I think centimorgans is the only one I actually remember that just sounds very like you would need a lot of training to speak this language.
I think it's like anything else, it's practice and learning to see patterns. And there are certain things which help. I mentioned earlier with the Golden State Killer, we had an X chromosome match. And something like that really helped. No, it was with Opal like a Jane Doe, but it was also true for the Golden State Killer. We had an X chromosome match. And when you have that, because if your perpetrator is male, and most of them are, you know then that you're looking at his maternal line because he got his X from his mother. And so it's a huge piece of information. So being able to understand X chromosome inheritance, you don't need a PhD to do that, but it's a little more complicated, yeah. And so, yeah, it's more, I think it's got a lot more to do with seeing patterns and seeing how things might fit together. Not everything comes out cookie cutter, and so sometimes you have to, be a little creative in how you put things together.
Because you referenced it, I'm going to ask you to explain the 4 grandmothers, if you would.
So I was at a conference last weekend in San Diego, the I4GG conference, which is all on investigative genetic genealogy. And one of the people shared that they'd heard that Paul Holes and Steve Kramer were calling themselves the grandfathers of IgG. And so they had now put together a T-shirt with the 4 grandmothers of IgG. And they had pictures of myself, Cece Moore, Colleen Fitzpatrick, and Margaret Press. So I think with the Billie Jean King answer to IgG.
We need to get them one of those T-shirts. Are there any investigations you're working on right now that, whether we would be familiar with the name, so to speak, or not, that you would be willing to share a little bit about?
The problem is that I can't talk about cases that we don't have confirmation on.
Okay, understood.
Yeah.
I got you. All right. I should have seen that coming.
So we talked a little bit about this, but did you have any interest in true crime before you came to this work?
It's an interesting question. I'll brag a little bit and say that my book has been nominated for an Edgar Award, which is kind of exciting. Thank you. And so they've been sending me little emails asking me for, anecdotal type stuff for when they have the award ceremony. And so one of the questions they asked was, what were your favorite childhood books? And I hadn't really thought about it, and I certainly hadn't made the connection, but my favorite books, it was actually an author I think was banned in the US. Her name was Enid Blyton. And she had two series of books that I had all of the books. I spent all my pocket money on them. They were The Famous Five and The Secret Seven. So for any of you who grew up in a British country, you probably had those books as kids. But they were kids who were solving crimes. And I had never thought about it. Those have been my favorite books from basically when I could read.
And later in your life, were you ever drawn to this type of material, or did you sort of come back and rediscover it after you retired?
I've actually always been a science fiction fan. So this is actually sort of a change of genre for me.
So genetic genealogy is a relatively new field, but it's obvious that it can be an extremely valuable tool for law enforcement. As the practice grows, do you think we'll reach a point where old-fashioned detective work is no longer required?
I don't think so, because actually even as part of IgG, you still need to do detective work, but also not every crime has DNA evidence. So, unfortunately, no. What you're basically doing with IgG is you're starting with, as I mentioned, the crime scene DNA goes into the FBI database. And the first thing that happens is that they then look for what they call hits. And in the CODIS database, it has to be an exact match. There are 13 or 14 states now, I think, that allow what is called familial testing. And with familial testing, they can use Y-DNA to look for first-degree relatives. So a first-degree relative is a parent, a child, or a sibling. And so you can get a little bit more information as to, so in the Golden State Killers case, it turned out actually that his brother had been arrested, I think it was on a DUI in Los Angeles, but it was before they were collecting DNA. So if he'd been arrested again, or if it had started earlier, he would have been arrested 40 years earlier. But it's a very powerful system, but you still got to, so once you've now got a hit, you still have to then connect the person to the crime scene. So let's say we've got a cigarette butt with DNA that matches the crime scene DNA. That's not enough. You have to have a nexus between the cigarette butt and the crime scene. So is there anybody who can place that person at the crime scene? I worked on a case actually out of Livermore where there was DNA evidence on a cigarette butt. It was outside the door of where somebody had been murdered. So the person it belonged to had actually been interviewed by the police long before. He'd been a person of interest. And in that case, what had happened is he'd been asked if he had been to this person. So, oh, no, never been there. Or he'd been there several years before or some other time than around the time of when the murder occurred. So in that case, it would be very easy then to say, okay, if you haven't been there in 3 years or never been there or whatever the answer was, the fact that it's there now, at the time of a murder has occurred, puts him at the scene of the crime. So you still need to have some police work going on. And of course, you also need somebody to put people under surveillance if you're going to do trash pulls. That's actually a lot of work, you know. Sometimes it can take weeks. You have somebody under surveillance before you actually see the person that you're interested in toss something out or follow them to McDonald's and, you know, get their coffee cup or whatever you're going to do. We actually have a case that we were working on where we were trying to do a trash pull, and the person must have realized that they were under surveillance. They started taking their trash to their ex-wife's house. Not sure what they told the ex-wife.
Yeah, that would prevent some surveillance. I am wondering, so when you have a situation, or have you ever had situations where you have DNA evidence from the scene of the crime, but it is actually not tied to the perpetrator?
I haven't. I mean, there've been a couple of cases where it turns out the DNA is a contamination. There was one that hit the news where somebody had had a heart attack and been taken by the EMTs to the hospital. And it turned out that the EMT had not worn gloves and it actually had been at a crime scene prior to taking this person to the hospital. And so the DNA from the crime scene was then on the gentleman who was taken to the emergency room. Of course, he had a good alibi.
Of course.
But it was an example of a crime scene being contaminated, so it is possible.
Wow. So you started with helping people find their families, but you actually used that skill set with your own family. You had a young man, or maybe not so young at the time, who you proved was not your father's son, which you knew before you had the results. They chose to carry on as though they actually were biologically father and son, despite scientific proof otherwise. Have you had other scenarios like that you, when you find an answer one way or the other, that you just, it's like an outcome you just didn't see coming?
I think it's often difficult for people to accept that something they've always believed was true isn't. I actually have a very dear friend who did DNA testing. She's now in her 90s. And this is now about 10 years ago that she did a test at Ancestry, and then I had uploaded the file to Family Tree DNA for her. Her parents had gotten divorced when she was, I think, about 2 years old. And so we thought it would be kind of fun to see if she had any half-siblings out there, because we knew that her father had remarried. So she started getting some emails from a fellow telling her that his mother-in-law was her half-sister. And he sent all kinds of information with names and so on, and so she politely wrote back and said, I think you've made a mistake, I don't recognize any of those names. So he persisted. And so I finally, she sent him an email saying, why don't you contact my friend Barbara, because she knows more about this than I do, but I think you've made a mistake. So of course I take one look at the results, and she has a complete X chromosome match with this woman. So from what you now know about the X chromosome, what does that tell you? That they share a father, right? So I tell my friend this, and she said, oh, well, I always thought my father was probably a playboy. And I said, it's not your father, it's her father. So what was interesting is her maiden name was O'Brien, and I'd never really looked at the admixture for her, the bioancestry. It was all Polish. There was no Irish anywhere. So, yeah, but we contacted the woman, and initially everything was very friendly, and then I changed my friend's tree on Ancestry, put the correct biofather in there. This woman then threatened to sue and said she was disgracing her father's name. And I said, I don't think that we're the ones disgracing your father's name.
So I got the "we're almost to time" signal. Casey, do you have anything else you would like to ask?
Yes, actually. So with the, with your work on the Golden State Killer case, although you remained anonymous for a while, I'm sure that now that you have publicly established yourself, your life has changed a lot. What is the big difference between before you started doing work, as specifically on this case, and now?
I get fan mail. I have people come up to me and ask me to sign things and do selfies. It's definitely different.
Do you get a thrill out of that, or are you kind of like, I don't want to be in the spotlight?
It's a little surreal, I guess. Mm-hmm. But it's also kind of fun, and I'm pleased that I've been able to help people, because that really is why we do this. I think anybody who's working in this field, it really is for the victims. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I also wonder, some of the cases that you discuss in the book, it sounds like so much work and so many hours went into solving these puzzles. I wonder, when you're in the process of the work, how do you maintain motivation to continue, or what keeps you going?
So I think probably the thing that I use most is gardening. I like growing things. It sort of acts as an antidote to the darkness of the work. And so I've sort of taken this another notch. I just signed up for a University of California Master Gardener program, which is really kind of fun. So I'm learning to be a better gardener. And yeah, it's somehow, what I do is so I'm growing all kinds of seeds. At the moment, I've been growing a lot of milkweed seeds. And yeah, something about sitting there and seeing these little seeds growing it's very reassuring, I guess.
Absolutely. I'm sorry, one last question. What is your process for starting to work on a new assignment? And what's the most important thing that you do to set yourself up for success?
Well, the most important part of any case is putting together a profile of what you know about the person you're trying to identify, because that's really important. So, things like I mentioned where, you try to figure out what their date of birth might be, what the geographic connection is, any physical characteristics. So, obviously for murder cases, you tend not to have that, but for rape cases, you do. Mm-hmm. You've quite often got, physical descriptions from the victims. And then just, really being aware of sort of the minutiae that you're running across. And then just really being careful when you're building trees. There are so many dead ends that you can go down. We were talking earlier about how sometimes amongst folks who are in, I guess, our parents' generation, quite often there might be a child that was born out of wedlock who was then brought up as a child of a different family, either a sibling or maybe a grandparent. And they'll even be on the census records that way. Mm-hmm. And then you might go through additional census records and discover that this child is now with a different family. So there are a lot of things that you need to really sort of pay attention to. Mm-hmm. So it's really, you need to be very much somebody who pays attention to detail, and that you keep close who it is you're looking for, mm-hmm. because that's quite often they'll suddenly pop up when you're not expecting them.
Thank you so much for being here, Barbara. We have really appreciated having you. It's been delightful. Thank you so much. We will be having a book signing after the event, so I believe that's going to start in about 10 minutes in the lobby. And thank you all for coming.